Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to day 4 of Carbon Crunch. So today we're focusing on the built environment, and I'm Claire Wildfire, your host for today's webinar. My role is Global Practice Leader for Cities at MacDonald, but my background is firmly in the sustainable built environment. So I started my career 30 years ago as a building services engineer, focusing on low energy buildings. So on this topic, despite some regional and sector-specific differences, it's really clear that there's a lot of commonality in the approaches we have to take. So today we'll be sharing thoughts on 3 of those common built environment themes that are critical to achieving net zero. So that's heating, retrofit, and embodied carbon. But first, taking a step outwards to do a bit of a recap on the imperatives that as an industry we have to be working towards. In relation to the 2050 net zero target, I see that there are 3 strands. So first, a clean energy revolution, which is transforming the energy system in both the supply, which is how we produce and distribute low carbon energy, but also the demand, which is how we use it, which is relevant to our buildings. But second, we need to curb energy demand because this transformation isn't not only financially, but also technically feasible without radically transforming our approach to energy conservation. And we have to get better at using the energy we do have more wisely. And then finally, for those carbon emissions that we just can't eliminate in our sector, we have to be conscious that those must be captured and stored, and that's stored forever. So the built environment is an integral part of this journey. And thinking back, we in our industry, in our sector, have been managing buildings' carbon emissions for decades, since energy conservation was first featured in the building regulations, which was back in 1992 through our much loved Part L. But it's only recently that we've seen the recognition that the built environment is part of a much wider integrated system. And we need to understand how buildings interact with other forms of infrastructure, such as transport, such as the energy system, because this is critical in driving wider behaviour and social change, and also in generating the more fundamental shifts to lower carbon ways of living. And encouragingly, we know that both the UK and the World Green Building Council are exploring this space. So that's a backdrop to the conversations we'll be having today. But before we start, a few housekeeping points. To say, following all of the presentations, I'll be directing your questions to our speakers. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function, which we're about to open. And so use it right from the beginning, but so that we can begin to track the questions which people begin to like. So you can click on like if you like a question, and then we'll aim to answer at the end the most popular questions. And we'll try and answer as many questions as we can in the time allotted. Just as another small point to make, we're aware that during some of the previous week presentations, some of the attendees had issues posting questions. This appears to be an issue with Microsoft Teams Live at the moment. So if you do experience any issues with not being able to see or submit questions, then we'll give you an email address to post them to instead, to send them to instead. And that's markcrouch@mottmac.com, which we'll post in the message bar now. And 2 more final things. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded, and also to mention that we'll be publishing a report at the end of following the end of the week, so that we can capture all the interesting issues from the Q&A, even if we don't get everything into the call. So on to today's agenda. Today's presentations are focusing on the built environment, so we'll learn how local area energy plans and building standards are leading the drive towards net zero. First, we'll hear from Andrew McMonagle from the Greater London Authority, and he'll be providing an outline of local area energy planning and how this is being applied to the Isle of Dogs. Then Ross Ramsey from the Scottish Futures Trust will showcase the new net zero public sector building standard for Scotland. And finally, we'll hear from Esther Galachi from Mott MacDonald on challenges with retrofit and some wider industry focus areas. So after these three great presentations, we'll have the Q&A session. And as I said, please submit your questions throughout. So first, I would like to now welcome Andrew McMonagle, who is planning lead for the Infrastructure Coordination Service at the Greater London Authority, to outline the concepts and benefits of local area energy planning and how this is being applied to the Isle of Dogs. Thank you, and over to you, Andrew.
Great. No, thank you very much, Claire, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone watching online this afternoon. So today I've been asked to briefly take you through our work preparing a local area energy plan for the Isle of Dogs in South Poplar. We're undertaking this in partnership with the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, UKPN, Cadent, and with technical input from the Mayor's Infrastructure Advisory Panel, which Claire here today is supporting us through as well. So just move on to the next slide, please. So to quickly set the context for those of you who are not familiar with the Isle of Dogs, the Isle of Dogs is one of London's largest opportunity areas, 30,000 new homes due to come forward over the next 10 years and 110,000 new jobs. It is also home to a huge existing residential and worker population centered around Canary Wharf, which some of you might be familiar with, the Docklands and so on. But interestingly, this location presents a complex mix of challenges as well, namely a highly dense population in some areas on a parallel to Hong Kong, for example, so definitely the densest in the UK. And also the area has unique assets such as canals, the river, and a variety of different land uses, which present an interesting opportunity for when you start thinking about heat, for example, as well. However, growth on this scale will require huge programs of infrastructure investment and a supportive strategy environment. And a key focus for us is moving away from traditional approaches towards planning for growth, in terms of infrastructure, by thinking about wider priorities such as decarbonisation and resilience in the face of climate change. So just moving on to the next slide, please. In terms of our approach to energy planning, we're heavily influenced by the emerging and shifting policy context of the UK government, but also local shifting targets as well. Many of you might be aware, for example, that the Mayor of London has brought forward his net zero target to 2030, and the GLA is doing a lot of work exploring different scenarios to reach his target as part of the London 1.5 degree plan. However, alongside this strategic sort of pan-London work, we're also seeing the emergence of locally led plans and area-based plans at a more local sort of scale. And these vary depending on levels of resourcing and internal capacity to deliver within the different local authorities that make up London. So for example, some of these strategies are very heavily focused just on heat, for example, whilst others are looking at the wider energy system and opportunities for building retrofit. So just move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the work that we're doing in the Isle of Dogs, we've chosen to prepare a local area energy plan for the area, given the whole system focus of such plans and the support that this sort of approach has from Ofgem. And in terms of the LAEP approach, it will enable us to answer key questions about how to decarbonize the local energy system while simultaneously supporting growth. That's a key priority as well, to support growth whilst decarbonizing. And also explore key questions such as how to meet the demand for warmth and hot water in every building, not just new buildings, but existing as well, and what we can do to reduce demand and increase efficiency of buildings relevant to the local context. We also want to understand the uptake of low carbon technologies, the likely uptake of EVs, heat pumps, etc., and how this impacts the capacity of electricity distribution networks. So a real solid focus on demand profiling and future demand profiling, given these changes to the energy system. Also, a final priority is to prioritize investment and future policy action led by the local authority. And this particularly is relevant to planning policy and the standards for buildings that you can govern through the planning system. But at the core of this work, we're exploring a range of different decarbonisation scenarios at this stage, looking at, for example, high heat, electrification, decarbonised gas, and testing these against locally determined evaluation factors, such as cost, disruption, and how this fits in with the local context. And the idea behind this approach is to have a strong locally led focus rather than a top-down assessment sort of imported from elsewhere. And we really want to demonstrate that local consideration of opportunities and constraint to evidence to residents, for example, that we're taking account of their needs. We're going to test options for decarbonising the energy system through a citizens' jury, so presenting different options and asking the community for feedback on the pros and cons and their local insights, because this is essential to the process of a sort of inclusive process, essentially, for energy planning, rather than just being a technocratic engineer-led process instead. This is also in part sort of recognition that buildings are people's homes and places of work. They're not just there to optimize the energy system. The output of this work will be identification of a preferred pathway and a system transformation roadmap that pinpoints low regret investments, key decision points for more substantial investments in wholesale change, but also planning policy as well. When does certain planning policy standards have to be tightened up and made more robust in order to achieve the preferred pathway? A key point I would like to make as well is a range of stakeholders will have responsibility for this roadmap, and that is why partnership and collaboration from the outset is going to be key. This next slide, please. I thought I would wrap up with a consideration of challenges and opportunities presented by this process. A key point I would make is that local authority capacity to engage is difficult. You know, this is a non-traditional space for local authorities being involved in this kind of energy system planning. So it's a lot of it is learning by doing and taking people on a journey through this process. Challenges we're also facing relate to the obtaining data and data on the building fabric and also uptake of low carbon technologies, for example, and investing in this data, making sure it's up to date and reflective of the circumstances at a particular point in time. It's going to be important that resourcing is committed to this activity going forward as well, particularly in terms of tracking process and considering residual emissions and offset, which is an increasing responsibility of local authorities as well. In terms of defining the scope of this work, whilst the LAEP methodology has been helpful for us, that's an Ofgem sort of sponsored methodology, there still remains no single agreed process to explore different scenarios and options that is accepted by industry and the regulators. So it's quite flexible how you do this, and there will be a point in time where this has to be lined up on a more strategic scale, I anticipate. More broadly as well, just to make the point, it is important that the plan speaks to the responsibilities of a local authority, meaning outputs that dovetail or act as an evidence base for planning policy is going to be key, and making sure that the evidence is defendable as well, particularly when you're imposing potential new costs on developers, consumers, and ultimately residents themselves. But in terms of a positive note to finish on, this ultimately represents an opportunity for developing a joined up strategy where everyone contributes from the outset, and it also provides the mechanism to get everyone bought in and aligned to a vision. So thanks very much, Claire.
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. And I see this is a really exciting point where we start thinking about how the buildings that we're designing link with the wider system. So I'm sure there'll be questions on that later. So thank you. And now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Ross Ramsey, who is Associate Director for Net Zero at the Scottish Futures Trust. So Ross will be outlining the new Net Zero Public Sector Building Standard for Scotland. This is a voluntary standard for non-domestic buildings with three main pillars of place, carbon and environment. So over to you, Ross.
Thank you, Claire. As Claire said, my presentation is about this Net Zero Public Sector Building Standard. But before I get into that, it's probably worth giving you some context and giving you some background to the organisation I work for Scottish Futures Trust, one of the co-creators of the standard. So our mission is to create world-class infrastructure for the people of Scotland, who were created over a decade ago by the Scottish Government. And we interact with public sector organisations, with private sector organisations, and also with the government itself. And our corporate priorities are aligned with those set out in Scotland's infrastructure investment plan. So to move towards a net zero emission society, to build sustainable and resilient places, but also to drive inclusive economic growth. So our team comprises around 80 or so infrastructure professionals. By background, I'm an engineer, but there are other legal and financial experts within our organisation. And you can see there the different work streams where we actually try and achieve these priorities. I won't pretend to know all the details of them all, but you may have guessed that I work within the net zero work stream. At the moment, net zero is covering just about everything that Scottish Futures Trust is doing. So I find that I'm interacting with all of the different teams in our organisation, and that is something that's captured within the standard. So if I can move to the next slide, please, Mark, if that's possible. Thank you. So the standard is actually something that's been following me around in my career for the last 5 or 6 years or so. So back in 2015, I worked for a small engineering consultancy called Mott, who were commissioned by Scottish Futures Trust to do some work around the gap in energy performance in public buildings. So the gap between model performance and actual performance. And that formed the kernel or the genesis of the standard. So why is it that we weren't achieving the modelled energy performance in these buildings? Scottish Futures Trust and some of their other public sector partners, like the Scottish Government, Zero Waste Scotland, and also branches of the NHS and local authorities, took an interest in this. And it went from being an idea of a standard that would help control energy performance to something much broader. So looking at carbon, the different aspects of carbon there. Also, as Claire's mentioned there, place and environment. So to really try and capture everything that we would want from our investments in public sector buildings. So if we move the clock forward to 2021, when I was working at MacDonald 5 months or so ago, I was actually doing some work in the public sector building standard to help try and finalise the documentation for it. I've since joined Scottish Futures Trust, and we are at a point now where we have final documentation for the standard, and it went to its steering group last week, so the omens are quite good there. If I can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the standard is voluntary, but we would like as many ambitious public sector organisations in Scotland to apply it as possible. That diagram that you can see there is slightly misleading in that it does predominantly cover new build, but if we've found actually in some of the Pathfinder projects that I'll come on to that major refurbishment is quite well suited to the standard as well. We can shape the actual targets and the remit of the standard to reflect what individual local authorities and individual public sector organisations have actually set out. So you'll probably be aware that many public sector organisations have, for example, declared that they seek to achieve aspects of net zero by 2030 or 2035, for example, and we can adapt what we set out as targets within that. It's intended that the standard will get better over time, so the best that's possible, or the better understanding of what's possible in terms of construction embodied carbon, in terms of operational carbon, will develop over time, and the standard will be developed to reflect that as well. So I can move on to the next slide there, please. Thank you. So just to give you some idea of what the structure of the standard actually looks like and how it's comprised. So if we look at it in the very broadest sense, there's these 3 aspects: place, carbon, and environment, and we break that down into individual objectives, of which there are 6. For me, one of the most interesting and distinctive parts about the standard is the place element of it. And actually, I'll put my hands up to say that this is a part that I know least about, but I'm most enthusiastic to learn about. So I'm working with some of my colleagues in SFT in this respect as well. But it asks several key questions about what it is you're proposing to do in terms of your investment, in terms of your building. So one of the things we need to do is define a need. So to identify what it is you're trying to do with your investment. And then we would apply a hierarchy to it to see whether or not existing assets can be used to service that need, or whether we can look to refurbish or combine services with other aspects of the public sector. And then finally, you may get to a point where you actually decide that you want to invest in a new major refurbishment building. It drives you to engage with the other aspects of the public sector as well, to make sure that we're maximising our investment across all the different organisations. And I have found actually in some ways that's the most powerful thing that we can do in terms of minimising carbon emissions, to get the right buildings in the right place for the right reasons. So place is very important in the standard, and it's something that we've been doing quite a lot of thinking of through the Pathfinder processes, which I'll come to in a moment, and also in scoping the documentation we've produced. When we come to carbon, so we've broken that down into 3 different aspects, which you'll no doubt be familiar with. So construction embodied carbon, operational energy, which started the idea of the standard, if you like, and then other whole life, which reflects the replacement of equipment and the maintenance that might go on the building through its life cycle. So for the first 2 aspects, construction embodied carbon and operational energy, what we've sought to do is to create targets early in the process. And for some, that's quite counterintuitive. So before you've done any modelling and detailed assessment of what's going to happen in your building, we drive you to make a commitment to actually achieving a target, which in many cases is derived from comparable best practice buildings. So for example, in the school sector, we may look to point you towards some of the recent brace of passive house schools that have achieved very good energy performance, as an example. So those targets have been scoped and simplified to some extent within the documentation, which you'll be able to see soon, to reflect the different usages and different building types. And what's very important within the process is that performance is then verified at the end, for the operational energy, but also for the indoor environment as well. So we want to see that energy performance delivered, and we want to see the indoor environment verified through post-occupancy evaluation later on as well, and that's a very important part of the process. And both the operational energy and indoor environment are closely linked to a requirement for detailed dynamic simulation modelling. So that's something we've taken special care to optimise within the documentation we've created, and it's an important part of making sure that once you've set your target, that you can refine and iterate towards it and have confidence that you'll actually deliver what you want in performance. So if I could move on to the next slide, please. So I'll just wrap up by going through some of the Pathfinder projects that I mentioned. So Scottish Future Trust has a history of learning through doing. So at the start of 2021, we had a suite of very initial documentation to show how the standard would work and some ideas about how that would work in practice. We went to apply these to 10 or so projects. So there's a whole range of different building types and buildings and construction stages as well. So 2 of the most interesting for me were the refurbishment projects. And actually, if you look at the fairly innocuous looking St Sophia's primary school, that's actually in some ways a bit of a landmark building, because it's going to be one of the first schools in the UK to achieve the ENERFIT standard, so the equivalent of passive house for refurbishment. So they're doing some really impressive things in terms of the energy performance, but also the indoor environmental performance. And it's interesting from another point of view as well, because that was a project that started with the idea that that would be a new primary school, that the old one would be demolished. But what happened through the analysis of place is that the community voiced their desire that the building be kept, that it was a valuable part of the place and the community. So finally, I'll just wrap up by saying that the other things that we learned through the Pathfinder process included the desire to learn more about how embodied carbon can be built into the process of design and construction. We found some counterintuitive things through the process. So, for example, the starting point for many was that they were going to put in an awful lot of PV generation in the buildings, and we found actually that in balancing that, that has an embodied carbon penalty, and some of our teams were looking to optimise that. Other things included the move from, in some of the constructions we looked at, from concrete frame to wooden frame buildings, and again, some issues came up there in terms of making sure that we would achieve the requirements in terms of insurance for the building materials. But anyway, that gives you some flavour for the Pathfinder projects, and I'll wrap up there and hand back to Claire.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ross. And I think this is to be applauded, because in the 3 decades that we've got to get to net zero, the question is often, well, how do we do it? So setting out a standard with targets and some of the how is a really important part of that. And I like the fact that for the bits we don't know about, you're just leaving those to be determined, and it's a sort of evolving thing. So brilliant. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to welcome Esther Galachi, Project Principal at Mott MacDonald. Esther will explore some of the issues around retrofit and also the need for embodied carbon to be addressed within the circular economy type approaches. And then that will set us up nicely for our panel discussion. So Esther, over to you.
Thanks very much, Claire, for the introduction. And just to follow on from Ross's presentation, this is going to be more of a conceptual presentation, building up on the very great examples that Ross has just shown us. And I'll start the presentation just talking about the World Green Building Council's Advancing Net Zero commitment, which is something that's driving the industry in terms of a voluntary voluntary commitment, driving the industry towards net zero buildings in a substantial way. And the next slide will illustrate the fact that Mott MacDonald is one of the signatories to this advancing net zero commitment, which of course not just requires us to look at our own operations, but of course one of our biggest impacts that we can make is with clients. And one question we often get from our colleagues is how can we do this? How can we get our clients to move towards net zero? How can we influence their decisions? And in the infrastructure world, we often hear this kind of statement that sometimes the best solution to building is not building at all. And the analogy of this in the buildings world is to try to see what we can work with that's already there to avoid building something from new. And this is what brings me to existing buildings, really, because from the point of view of net zero and advancing net zero in a substantial way, existing buildings are the major part of the equation for the following reason. If we go to the next slide, the fact that over 80% of buildings that will exist in 2050 already exist today. So if you think about that, that's quite an important statement to, the fact that we are often obsessed with new buildings. So what can we do about net zero in new buildings? But actually what we need to focus on really is existing buildings. And next I'm going to talk to you about why existing buildings and refurbishments and renovation projects aren't particularly a matter of focus, or haven't been, although currently, for example, the EU Green Deal has a renovation wave program that is going to increase this by a great amount. But generally, the barriers to refurbishment are things that, well, people aren't really incentivized to do them. So there's lack of incentives, lack of government drivers, policy drivers. But there's additional work, additional risk needs to be taken on associated with existing buildings. Sometimes you need additional surveys to be done. The creativity of designers can be constrained, and often can be existing operational challenges to construction. So. I worked in a project in Paris, for example, in a very Haussmannian center of Paris. That's a gorgeous project, wonderful to work on, very, very challenging. And it's something that not everybody wants to take on, although these projects can be absolutely beautiful. But But the important point here is that if we want to go towards net zero, there needs to be an absolute step change in refurbishment projects, and not treat them just as a heritage one-off project, but as the norm. Because as the next slide shows, the World GBC, the World Green Building Council, has shown really that if we want to get to net zero in the built environment, then we need to increase renovation rates by 3% every year starting in 2017. So we need to shift our way of thinking in a major way from new construction to renovation of existing buildings and refurbishment. And this is something, like I said, there are some programs starting already, but we are only at the beginning of this. And the way that the way that we think about existing buildings, the increase of attention, the increasing attention towards existing buildings and renovations is usually framed in the context of embodied carbon. And embodied carbon is often the metric that is being used for existing buildings. However, we also use embodied carbon as a metric in new construction in design, in the design process. And the way that Ross was talking about in the previous presentation about using embodied carbon calculations as a tool to iterate, to improve. The next slide is the one that will show you this, that it's a circular process, a constant cycling of exchanges between designers, specifiers, even within the design team, architects, carbon consultants, sustainability people. But the important thing here is that, as opposed to maybe previous years and previous decades, we need to bring in the materials people into the conversation much earlier, because in order to come up with meaningful numbers and meaningful results, we need to get the information about those materials quite early on. So manufacturers, contractors, and even the end-of-life people such as recyclers and refurbishment people need to come into the picture. Salvage material markets need to come into the picture much more so than they already have. Although there is there is a way to use benchmarks, for example, and industry data for this. The meaningful results often come from direct engagement with the supply chain. So it's just important when we consider embodied carbon and to be able to come up with meaningful answers and meaningful results to compare to targets. We need to get this into the design process to get material specifications in earlier in the process where we have been doing so far. And in terms of how to tackle this, there's some good guidance out there and some low-hanging fruit increasingly from various institutions. And the next slide just gives you a couple of those. Like Architecture 2030, an organization that is aimed towards driving net zero, it points out very, very acutely that 3 materials, concrete, steel, and aluminium, are responsible for 20% of global emissions. So that's your low-hanging fruit right away. And there are several initiatives in terms of reducing embodied carbon in concrete, for example, and the other 2 materials as well. So this is all progressing very well, but when we are designers or constructors of buildings, this is where we really need to focus. And in the slide, there's also a few ideas from the Rocky Mountain Institute of this sort of low-hanging fruit, where embodied carbon can be reduced fairly easily with not much cost premium. But of course, every project is bespoke, and you need to think about it in the context of individual projects. And really, to close this conversation, this presentation, I just wanted to really point out, though, that although embodied carbon is important, it is the beginning of the journey. It's not the end of the journey. It's not the end game. Embodied carbon is something we need to consider, but we also need to consider other aspects, other parts of this picture, really, because where we are trying to head is much more of a circular economy thinking, a circular way of looking at materials. As William MacDonald, who's one of the founders of the circular economy way of thinking, he says, embodied carbon is not a bad thing as long as it keeps being embodied and keeps being cycling through the technosphere, our technical world. So what we need to consider is whether that embodied carbon stays embodied. We need to look at end of life. We need to look at recyclability, salvaging. We need to look at supply chain and supply chain transparency, and we need to look at what policies there are to incentivize this way of thinking, as well as the logistics and the connectivity, not just within our industry, but the connectivity with other industries that helps this cycling of materials in our technical world. So I will end the presentation there, and we'll pass it back to Claire for the QA session.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say to all speakers, superb timekeeping. Thank you. Makes our lives so much easier. And also, I gather we are one of the days that's been having problems with question posting. So as a reminder, if you are having a problem, then email instead to Mark Crouch, which is mark.crouch@mottmac.com. And we gave his email address at the beginning of the chat, and send them that way. So looking at the great questions we've got coming through, the first one I would like to start with Andrew. Andrew, if it's okay, well, if people can, if our presenters can turn their or keep their cameras on, that'd be brilliant. So Andrew, coming your way is the question: the housing targets that many local authorities have seen to be the housing targets that many local authorities have seem to be driving growth in greenfield housing estates, which feels very wrong from a carbon and environmental perspective, and also needs new transport and other infrastructure, which is locking carbon in for the future. What's the solution to this?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And it's a bit of a tricky one for me to answer, actually, that one, because I'm based in London and we don't really have development occurring on the green belt in the same way that other local authorities across the UK may be dealing with. However, instinctively, my answer is yes, it probably does seem wrong to be developing, ongoing urban sprawl and continuing expansion of cities and urban areas out into the countryside in terms of carbon impacts. But I think we have to be pragmatic and realize that this growth will continue to occur. And so how do we minimize that impact of that development that's occurring? And the key message, building on what Esther said and Ross as well, is higher performance standards for buildings, getting it up into those APC ratings, A, B, C at the top, rather than performance at the lower sort of levels. But also we're seeing emergence of policy guidance, which is pushing us in the right direction as well, with the Future Home Standard, which is in development, and also the recent requirement for all new builds to have EV charge points incorporated on site, for example, as well. These present emerging opportunities to reduce the carbon impact of that new development, which may not be quite so well connected to public transport networks and so on. But I think that, like I said before, the key is going to be that supportive policy environment to drive up those standards for that development in these greenfield areas.
Thank you. I'm just thinking we might be having problems with cameras because we can only see Ross. But anyway, we'll plow on. Ross or Esther, any additional points you wanted to make on that? If not, I will come on to the next question, which is popular. And Ross, this is coming your way, which is, so the word place or place-based sounds lovely, but what does this actually mean in practice? Can we as a panel help to define what we mean by that word?
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so I can maybe have a first bash at that. So this is something I can understand the question here. That's something I wrestled with as a mechanical engineer earlier on here when I first been introduced to the standard. So within the confines of the standard, it means that you follow a process, and what it seeks to avoid is as I've said, the wrong projects for the wrong reasons. So we need to apply a hierarchy. You need to define a need, and you need to demonstrate that you have engaged the right elements of the public sector. And to manage that process, we've created some documents which we would seek to be completed at the early stages of a project. And it's almost before there's a project, before you get locked into the REBA cycle, before you know where your site's going to be, what building you actually need to meet your requirements. We have acknowledged the fact that that's quite a difficult thing to capture, and it's not the case that people haven't been trying to do this before. But what we hope to do with the standard is to channel that early in the project, and there will be a role for a verifier. So someone has a reasonable degree of competence in this area, someone who has a background in preparing business cases or strategic outline cases, and that they will almost be the gatekeeper to decide whether or not the project in question actually meets that requirement in place. And I would acknowledge that that's going to be quite difficult. We anticipate some quite challenging conversations around that in the first set of projects that we deal with. So that maybe gives some impression on what place or place-based means within the confines of the standard that I've described. I don't know, Claire, if you want to say anything wider about that.
Yes. So Andrew, I'm thinking that from the perspective of a local authority, you may have an additional thought that's in a slightly different dimension to the applicability of the thinking of grounding things in place.
Well, I mean, I think that a key consideration, say, with the LAP work that I'm leading on is this idea of how does it dovetail as well with planning policy as well. So what is the so thinking about place and planning policy on a unified basis. For example, the a good example I was thinking of was the density of the Isle of Dogs, say, with the height of the buildings and so on, and the likelihood of overshadowing of those buildings, and how can you ensure that the planning policy recognizes these issues and make sure that in terms of energy efficiency, it's factoring in these constraints basically at specific to the place-based local context. So I think that you need to have that adaptability that responds to the local circumstance as well, and how that dovetails with planning policy as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So looking at the questions, just there's one that I've lost that I want to ask. Right, so building from what Ross shared about what Scotland is doing, Esther, coming to you, is there an equivalent net zero building standard that applies in the rest of the UK? And then maybe also, Ross, after that, you could build on whether the Scottish Futures Trust standard is transferable to beyond Scotland. So Esther first. You might be on mute.
That's a good point. Thank you for that. The UK GBC has been quite instrumental in coming up with something that can serve as a start to that discussion in the UK. They came up with the framework definition for net zero carbon buildings, and of course, LETI, the London Energy Transformation Initiative, has been very active in this field of trying to really come up with how to define these. I am not aware of a similar standard to what Ross described, but I think there are aspects of it. So in England, definitely there's the various benchmarking standards that drive this, and they have sort of zero carbon versions of them, or net zero versions of them. But it's a really good question about the Scottish standard being possible to transfer, because at the moment it's all driven voluntarily, and it's quite fragmented in the UK as a whole. And I think that from what I can see in the south of England, it's all been driven by what's been done before, essentially, with the benchmarking systems and trying to meet the requirements within those. But yeah, Ross, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Esther. So I suppose the first thing I would say is that responding to the question about whether or not the Scottish version could be used elsewhere. Been discussing this to some extent this morning, actually, and immediately we can't think of a reason why that wouldn't be the case, but I would be a little bit cautious here in that for the last 5 or 6 months we've been creating the documentation around the standard, and that's quite voluminous now. It's something like 200 to 300 pages. I would probably want to go back and check that just to make sure that there's nothing that necessarily conflicts with it being applied elsewhere. It does make reference to some Scottish specific policies. It does make reference to some Scottish specific best practice, but to be honest with you, much of it could be taken and adapted elsewhere if people wanted to do so. So from that point of view, it could be taken elsewhere. I would acknowledge that the standard does draw upon a lot of the excellent other environmental standards that have been referred to, so Passive House, LETI, UKGBC, WELL, BREEAM, etc. And indeed many of the Pathfinder projects that I highlighted earlier on were already making use of some of those other standards. We don't want to interfere with that. We would rather overlay and just reinforce some of the things that these other standards are doing.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think as a trailblazer, I think some of the other, outside Scotland, some of the sectors are taking the approach that you've begun to define, and so it's not about the standard per se, but it's about the approach that you're taking is now being used in particular sectors like the health sector to define sector specific standards. Okay, looking at other popular questions, this is a hard one. I'm going to send it your way, Ross, first, which is how can we get the infrastructure needed for heat networks delivered?
Okay, thanks, Claire. That is an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think what is needed to some extent, and I'd said earlier on that I don't pretend to have all the answers in this respect, because I'm working at the moment with some of my colleagues who have financial and legal backgrounds, and these are challenges as well, which probably I as an engineer don't fully understand. But for me, one of the main challenges is understanding where different technologies are going to be deployed with some degree of confidence. So if we have that confidence, we can understand that business cases and the risk of actually investing in district heat infrastructure can be adopted by both the public sector and the private sector and their respective roles within that. And I think that's probably a lot of what Andrew had tried to address in his presentation. So for me, understanding with some degree of confidence what technology is going to be deployed where will start to set some of that in motion.
Brilliant, thank you. So Andrew, I'm coming to you next anyway. So you may want to build on Ross's answer on district heat networks, but also answer this next question, which was popular, which is how are departments within local authorities working together to deliver net zero, and what needs to be in place to support this?
Sure. I mean, just to build on Ross's question that Ross was asked, I think, again, I keep going on about planning policy, but I think that is also key to creating the preconditions for the establishment of the heat network as well, particularly on new developments. So as an example, in the new London plan, there's provisions in there which mandate all new developments to have that opportunity to connect to heat network in the future when one perhaps may come online. So it's about future-proofing development. So when maybe the commercial viability for a heat network does exist, or the appropriate consortium of partners established to establish a heat network becomes available, then you can make that connection. So I think that's a key message for the future of heat networks, is how do you future-proof development to make use of that as an option going forward in the future, even when it may not be viable at this particular point in time. To move on to the second part, the second question you asked me, Claire, I think it is a very complicated space how local authorities work to deliver net zero. And like I mentioned in my presentation, there's uneven and varying capacity within local authorities to deliver on a lot of their declared climate emergencies and net zero targets and so on. And that's because this is a new space for local authorities to be engaged in, which previously they were not so much involved in. I think the key is partnership, working with stakeholders, recognizing that the energy system has many different partners involved in delivering outcomes, and through processes like the local area energy planning approach, you can create that mechanism to establish partnership working with, say, DNOs, GDNs, the regulator, and also consultancy support as well from the wider industry sector too. And I just make an observation that in ED2 currently, so the electricity distribution price control period, which is underway at the moment for the next price control, a lot of the DNOs, like in the London context, UKPN and SSEN, they're establishing local authority support offers within their business for the next regulatory period. And these will be teams of people who can support local authorities with data collection and making models and tools available so that you can input data assumptions into their tools, and it will essentially spit out an answer around your net zero objectives and so on. So I think that the sector is responding to this capacity constraint to facilitate better partnership working as well, which is a positive development.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm just at this point going to do a plug for a report that we authored for the UK Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition called A Place-Based Approach to Net Zero, which has 4 points that are pretty much covered by most of the questions and answers. So that's powers, partnerships, skills, which is P for people, and data and digital platforms, which is the power of data to help make decisions and create transparency on the reasons decisions are being made. So we can, if we haven't already, we can put a link to that report in the chat. So probably we've got time for 2 more questions. So Esther, this one's coming your way, which is really, I like this question. I think it's right up your street. So end of life is an important part of circularity and therefore net zero. How does it actually feature in practice?
Thanks, Claire. It's a really good question, and it's a complicated one in my view, just because it touches on so many other aspects of the economy that's not just the construction world. So if you think about those 3 materials that I was talking about, steel, concrete, aluminium, those are materials that are used obviously elsewhere in the world as well, not just in the built environment or in buildings. So it's suddenly this question comes to those industries and the end of life part of those industries, like the recyclers, to think about how they cater to the industries that they serve. So, for example, in buildings, and we have this conversation with the concrete industry representatives, that in order for us as designers, specifiers, we need to have that information from them. So it's something that they haven't been used to. So a lot of the metals manufacturers, for example, they, buildings or construction is part of their market, but they're not necessarily used to providing this information to specifiers in order for them to be able to make these decisions. So to answer the question, how does it actually feature in practice? What we need, what architects, designers, and the construction world needs is information, transparency. So some of those industries need to have that information available. So whether we're talking about material passports or we're talking about enhanced environmental product declarations or whatever the form it is, we need to have that information in order to assess end of life options, in order to look at what can happen to the product, think about product take-back laws, extended producer responsibility, and those sorts of things. So it becomes suddenly a huge topic that looks beyond really what we are used to dealing with in construction, which is why I think there's just so many conversations happening around this. And of course, there's also parts of it where we're trying to look at how we as designers and moving from buildings to products, so looking at DFMA, design for manufacture, is how we move our own mentality from being building designers to product designers. And that at that point, you're looking at how you can design the end of life of a product to account for circularity, so the product can be moved back into that technological cycle, can be reused, disassembled, so on and so forth. So we also need to change our thinking in order to cater to this.
Thank you very much. I am going to try and squeeze one more question in case there's a very succinct answer from Ross, because it relates to that question about refurbishment versus new build. So do we have an idea of what % cost uplift this way of thinking will add to refurbishment versus new build, referencing back to the school that was shown on the earlier slide?
Yes, we do actually. So the St. Sophia's school that I'd mentioned earlier on had a budget that was almost comparable with a new building regulations compliant school. So in the end, you would have a school which would have very high energy performance and very good environmental performance as well, all being well. But to get there at the moment, it would appear that the cost involved in that is comparable with an entirely new build school based on a building regulations compliant cost model. So I'm not saying that there aren't means by which we could start to bring that cost down, but it's quite formidable in terms of cost at the moment. If that helps answer some of your question there, Claire.
Thank you. So I am one more question, 30 seconds, relating to COP26, which is, what do you want to come out of COP26 relating to the built environment? So we will, so Andrew, then Ross, then Esther, and then we'll wrap up.
I mean, I think ultimately clearer set of ambition would be very helpful, and more binding targets to compel action. That's essentially with the more binding targets, you and bringing them forward, you'll be able to compel the action that's required. We're still obviously in that state of paralysis in many respects at the moment. So that's what I would like to say.
Thank you, Ross.
So I think things have changed recently in the property industry for a number of reasons. So if we look at retail and offices, the way that we use those and the number that we'll need going forward is going to be pretty different from what we've all experienced previously. So I would like to see a solution to that actually helps us achieve net zero. So again, coming back to the points about reuse and refurbishment of buildings, can we get better at that? Can we make better use of these assets, which are probably not going to be used for retail and office uses going forward?
Brilliant, thank you. And Esther, what's your ask of COP26?
Well, in addition to what Andrew was saying, obviously targets and binding KPIs, I would also like to see indirectly a way to enable the industry to become less fragmented, for us to work together towards these and mechanisms to do that. So there's loads of reasons, which we won't have time to discuss, but loads of reasons why the industry is so fragmented. But I think that would be the key to actually achieving net zero in practice, is to try to remove those barriers to us working as a unified industry. Brilliant,
thank you. So targets and working out how to be less fragmented as an industry. Okay, so as a wrap up, one thing is, please look out for the post-event write-up, which will be released in the near future, summarising the key themes discussed over the course of the week. Also, please do look out for our new climate change web pages, or please have a browse of them, because we're putting the links in the chat. Then to pick up on the COP26 theme, that we will be posting about the Mott MacDonald activities in COP, because excitingly, there's quite a lot going on. So these include contributing to the Resilience Hub and the Sustainable Innovation Forum, which is the private sector's presence at COP26, plus a range of other virtual and in-person activities coming from our Glasgow office. So we do hope that you can join us for some of these activities throughout the 2-week period, either in person or virtually. Then finally, a thank you to all our presenters. We're now nearing the end of not just this webinar, but the whole of our Carbon Crunch week. We've focused on a particular infrastructure sector each day, and it is so obvious through all the conversations that enabling quicker decarbonisation will only be achieved through a systems approach. So as we discussed today, the built environment connecting with the energy sector and the transport sector, thinking about place as a driver, what people want to achieve on their own back doorstep, recognising the linkages, synergies and interdependencies that exist when you start thinking about things as that system. So with a final approach, final point about the power of digital to help unlock some of those opportunities. So just my last point is a call to arms. So we really do have the opportunity ourselves to positively shape these behaviours for future generations in the assets and infrastructure and buildings that we're designing. So please do think about your space, what you can do that's not waiting for the targets, and just pulling together in that direction. Thank you very much for joining, everybody.